The rain came in sideways that October evening, the kind that didn't bother falling straight down but slanted hard across Ravenwood's older neighborhoods like it had somewhere more important to be. Maple leaves rust orange and dark red pressed flat against the wet sidewalks, sealing themselves to the concrete as if they'd grown there. The street lamps along Caldwell Avenue blurred into long amber smears on the surface of every puddle. Daniel Carter downshifted his pickup truck at the corner of Caldwell and Morse, listening to the familiar complaint from the transmission, a grinding hesitation that he kept meaning to fix and kept not fixing because there was always something more urgent. There was always someone else's emergency. Tonight it was 14 Caldwell. The dispatch note had said, "Master bathroom pipe burst, water in ceiling, client unreachable, housekeeper on site." He'd taken the call at 8:47 p.m. After getting Lily settled, after reading her 2 chapters of the book about the lighthouse keeper's daughter, after sitting at the edge of her bed until her breathing slowed and her small hand loosened its grip on the quilt. He'd checked on her twice before leaving, left the hallway light on, texted the neighbor, Mrs. Pierce, who had a key and didn't mind. Now he idled in front of a house that, even in the dark rain, announced itself with a kind of quiet authority. Not ostentatious, no columns, no fountain, no gate with initials wrought in iron. Just a 3-story federal-style home in dark gray stone with clean proportions and window trim painted the color of old bone. The kind of house built by someone who had money but didn't need to prove it. The housekeeper, an older Guatemalan woman named Rosa, who wore a rain poncho over her nightgown and looked exhausted and frightened, met him at the service entrance. She spoke in quick, worried English about water coming through the kitchen ceiling, about the sound it had made before she shut the main valve. Daniel pulled on his work gloves and went inside. What he found in the first 20 minutes was the burst pipe. What he found in the next 40 minutes was considerably worse. He had started in the basement utility room, which was his habit not because the instructions told him to, but because a house was a system, and systems had to be read from the bottom up. He had learned this not from any manual but from 15 years of practice, and before that from 4 years at the University of Illinois studying structural engineering, and before that from his father, who had been a foreman on bridge crews in downstate Illinois, and who believed that if you couldn't see the bones of a thing, you didn't understand the thing at all. The basement told him several stories at once. The copper supply line to the second-floor bathroom had indeed burst a clean fracture at a joint, the kind that happened when water temperature fluctuated too sharply too many times. That was the presenting problem. That was what Rosa had called about. But the junction box mounted to the north wall was a different matter. Daniel stood in front of it for a long moment, flashlight steady, not touching anything. The conduit, entering from the exterior, showed a hairline crack where it passed through the foundation small enough to miss if you weren't looking, large enough to have let moisture seep in over months. The insulation inside was darkened in a way that had nothing to do with age. 2 wires, he could see without even opening the panel fully, showed signs of heating at their connection points. Not burning. Not yet. The kind of slow, invisible degradation that announced itself, when it finally did announce itself, all at once. He pulled out his phone, opened his Notes app, and typed, "Junction box moisture intrusion connection points degrading. Thermal event risk. Do not restore main power without full inspection." Then he kept moving. The gas line ran along the east wall, and he found it on his second pass. A fitting where the line connected to the branch running up to the kitchen range. Not a rupture. A weep, a slow seep around an improperly seated compression ring. The kind of thing that on a calm, ventilated day might dissipate without incident. The kind of thing that, combined with an electrical fault 50 feet away, introduced a calculus that Daniel didn't like at all. He worked through the night. He worked the way he had always worked, methodically, without shortcuts, without the performance of busyness. He fixed the burst pipe first because it was causing active water damage, and because stopping the water gave him cleaner access to everything behind the walls. Then he addressed the gas fitting, shut off the branch valve, disassembled the connection, reseated the ring properly, tested the seal with a pressure gauge from his kit. He did not have the right gauge for gas work. He had a general-purpose pressure gauge that was not technically rated for natural gas applications. But it was what he had, and a reading was better than no reading, and the reading was good. The electrical work he approached last and most carefully. He did not repair the junction box that required a licensed electrician and parts he didn't carry. What he did was isolate the affected circuit, label it clearly on the panel, and leave written instructions taped to the inside of the box door, explaining exactly what Rosa or the homeowner would need to tell an electrician. He was specific. He used the kind of language that would mean something to a professional. By 3:40 a.m., the water was off, the gas was sealed, the electrical risk was quarantined and labeled, and the immediate structural issue he had noticed, almost in passing, that the water intrusion had been wicking into a load-bearing section of the north basement wall for some time. Softening the mortar between the old fieldstone was documented in his notes with a recommendation for a mason to assess within 60 days. He found a notepad in Rosa's kitchen. She had fallen asleep in the armchair near the back door, and he wrote out his work in clear, plain language. What he'd found, what he'd fixed, what still needed professional attention. He wrote it the way he used to write site reports, not for the record, but for the person who would read it next and needed to know exactly where to start. At the bottom of the page he wrote, "Total." He left the notepad on the kitchen table, waited with a coffee mug so it wouldn't blow if a door opened. He let himself out the service entrance quietly, so as not to wake Rosa. The rain had softened to a mist. He sat in his truck for a moment with the engine off, listening to the tick of the cooling metal, feeling the tiredness settle into his shoulders. He thought about Lily. He thought about whether Mrs. Pierce had checked on her. He checked his phone, a text from Mrs. Pierce at 11:15. All good. She's sleeping like a rock. Go do your thing. A second text at 2:30. Still good. I'll stay till you're back. He sent a reply. Heading home now. Thank you, Eleanor. He started the truck. The transmission ground once in protest, then released. He drove home through the quiet of Ravenwood at 4 a.m, the mist hazing the street lamps into soft globes, leaves dragging in the gutter current from last night's rain. He didn't think about what he'd done at 14 Caldwell. He thought about whether he'd remembered to buy orange juice, because Lily liked orange juice with her pancakes on Fridays, and this was a Friday. He had not remembered to buy orange juice. He stopped at the all-night convenience store on Route 9 and bought a carton of Tropicana and a small bag of coffee, and he drove the rest of the way home, thinking about nothing much at all. Clara Whitmore landed at Ravenwood Regional at 7:15 a.m. on a flight from Philadelphia, where she had spent 3 days in meetings with the infrastructure financing group at Meridian Capital. The meetings had gone well, which meant they had gone the way she had planned them to go, which was the only way Clara recognized results. She was 41 years old, the founder and CEO of Whitmore Development, and she had built the company from a 2-person consulting practice, operating out of a rented office above a dry cleaner on Elm Street, into a regional development firm with a portfolio of commercial and residential projects. Worth, at last valuation, slightly north of $340 million. She had done this in 14 years. She had done it largely without partners, largely without the benefit of inherited capital or institutional backing, and largely without the kind of praise that the industry distributed reflexively to men who accomplished half as much. She was not a cold woman. She was precise. There was a difference, though she had stopped bothering to explain it to people who hadn't earned the explanation. She had grown up the second daughter of a plumbing contractor in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, a fact she neither hid nor advertised, a fact that had shaped her understanding of both what it meant to build something and what it cost. Her father had worked long hours, and she had respected him and understood only much later, when the hours of her own working life began to accumulate, what those hours had taken from the time that couldn't be recovered. Her assistant, a young man named Trevor, met her at the arrivals curb with a black umbrella and the morning's briefing. He had learned over 2 years not to lead with small talk when she had just landed. He led instead with, "Rosa left a message at 6 a.m. There was a plumbing emergency at Caldwell last night. Repair crew came in. Everything's handled." Clara took her bag from him. "What kind of emergency?" "Burst pipe, second floor. Insurance notation needed?" Rosa said the repair person left a note. She said it was Trevor checked his phone. She said it was a lot more than just the pipe. Clara got into the car. The note was waiting on her kitchen table, exactly where Rosa had found it before calling Trevor. Clara read it standing up, still in her coat, her rolling bag beside her. She read it once quickly and then again more slowly. What she held was not a service ticket. It was a technical assessment. Whoever had written this had not merely fixed a pipe, they had conducted what amounted to a preliminary safety audit of a century-old house and communicated the findings with the precision of someone who had written many such reports. The electrical notation was specific enough to be immediately actionable. It named the circuit, the symptom, the failure mode, and the type of specialist required. The gas fitting description included the brand and fitting size. The note about the north basement wall, the masonry issue, was the kind of observation that required knowing what you were looking at. Clara looked at the bottom of the page. Total, $0. Fixed. No name, no company, no phone number. She turned the page over. Nothing. She stood in her kitchen in her coat for a long moment, listening to the house. The boiler ticked. Rain moved against the kitchen window. Everything that should be quiet was quiet. "Trevor," she said. He appeared in the doorway. "Find out who came here last night." The dispatch company that covered Caldwell's neighborhood, a mid-sized local outfit called Ravenwood Home Services, had sent a contractor from their on-call list. The contractor's name, per their records, was Daniel Carter, self-employed, operating as Carter Repairs. Address on file: 22 Linden Shore Road, near Autumn Lake. "He's on our preferred list," the dispatcher told Trevor, slightly defensive. "He does good work, doesn't overcharge." "That's accurate," Trevor said. Clara drove herself. She did not tell Trevor where she was going. She drove her own car, a black Volvo. Not the Bentley her assistant sometimes booked for client meetings, because she didn't want this to feel like what it might look like from the outside. A wealthy woman descending on a tradesman's address with a driver. She had grown up in a neighborhood not entirely unlike Linden Shore Road. She remembered what it looked like when someone arrived to make a point. Linden Shore Road ran along the south edge of Autumn Lake, which in October was steel gray and wind-creased and gave off the smell of cold water and fallen leaves. The houses were modest, some well-maintained, some tired, a few showing the particular dignity of old places cared for by people who didn't have much but had standards. Number 22 was a Cape Cod with white siding and green shutters. A small porch with a railing that had recently been painted, a maple tree in the front yard, so large and old it had to be a reason the house was built there in the first place. A man was crouched at the base of the neighbor's fence, resetting a post that had heeled over in the rain. He wore work pants and a canvas jacket, and he worked without hurry, tamping the base with a rubber mallet and checking the plumb with a level held against the post. He did this twice before he seemed satisfied. He heard her car. He didn't stop working immediately. He finished what he was doing, set down the mallet, and then stood and turned. Daniel Carter was not what Clara had imagined, though she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge she had been imagining something. He was broad-shouldered in the way of men who worked physically but not performatively, with a steady face, not handsome in the catalog sense but angular and considered, the kind of face that looked like it thought before it spoke. He was maybe 38. His work jacket had a small rip at the shoulder that had been stitched closed with thread that nearly matched. He looked at her without alarm or particular curiosity. "Mr. Carter," she said. "I'm Clara Whitmore. You were at my house last night. 14 Caldwell Avenue." A brief pause. "I was. You fixed the pipe?" "Among other things." Clara held up the note he had left. "You wrote this." He looked at it from where he stood, 10 feet away, and nodded. "And you left without your name," she said. The question, the one she'd been shaping since she'd read the note, came out quieter than she intended. Not accusatory. Something closer to bewildered. Daniel Carter looked at her steadily. He did not seem uncomfortable with the silence that followed. "Because the job needed fixing," he said. Not applause. The house on Linden Shore Road had been built in 1962 by a man named Garrett, who had worked for the County Water Authority and fished Autumn Lake every weekend until he died. His widow had sold it to a young couple in 1994. The young couple had sold it to Daniel's aunt in 2001, and Daniel had bought it from his aunt's estate 3 years ago for considerably below market value, partly because it needed work and partly because it was close to Lily's school. He had spent the first 6 months fixing what needed fixing. The roof, 2 windows whose frames had rotted, the bathroom floor where the tile had lifted, and the subfloor beneath had gone soft with old moisture. He had done all of it himself. On weekends and evenings, the way his father had done things, not because he couldn't afford to hire it done, but because there was satisfaction in understanding what you lived inside of. Lily had been 4 when they moved in. She was 7 now, and she had grown up in this house the way children grow into places that feel chosen rather than inherited with confidence, with ownership, with the particular ease of a child who knows where everything is and knows someone is always there. She had her mother's coloring fair skin, dark eyes that went very dark when she was concentrating, hair that couldn't decide between brown and black. She had Daniel's habit of going still when something interested her, of fixing on a thing with a quality of attention that most adults didn't bring to most things. Friday mornings in the Carter house had a shape. Daniel was up at 6, before Lily, because the kitchen needed to be warm and the coffee needed to be started, and pancakes, her standing Friday request, needed time he didn't rush. He used the recipe from a card in his mother's handwriting, laminated now because the original had gotten flour on it, and he'd wanted to preserve the handwriting. Brown butter, a little vanilla, buttermilk when he had it. He made the batter while the cast iron heated, and he'd learned to make the pancakes in a specific size because Lily had opinions about what constituted a proper pancake, and he respected the opinions. She came down at 6, 45 inches her school clothes she dressed herself now, had for a year wearing the burgundy sweater he'd bought 2 weeks ago because she'd pointed at it in the store window without asking for it, which was the surest signal he'd learned to read. "It's Friday," she said, sitting at the kitchen table with the authority of someone confirming a fact they are pleased about. "It is. Pancakes. Ahead of you." She watched him cook with her chin in her hand. She had a book open on the table. She always had a book open somewhere, but she wasn't reading it yet. She was watching him, the way she sometimes did, with a quality of attention that he noticed and didn't remark on. He'd learned that remarking on it made her self-conscious. "You got home late," she said. "Did I wake you?" "No." "Mrs. Pierce left at 4. I heard the door." He turned from the stove. "You were awake at 4? "A little. Then I went back to sleep." She said this matter-of-factly, as if waking at 4 in the morning were a minor administrative detail. "Were you fixing something far?" "Not so far. Caldwell Avenue. That's the big houses. Some of them." She considered this. "Did you fix it?" She nodded once, satisfied, and opened her book. This was the life Daniel Carter had built and continued to build. He was not hiding from it. He was not suffering through it with quiet, noble resignation. He was, in the most literal sense, living it, choosing it each morning. The pancakes and the book and the drive to school and the workday shaped around a 2:30 pickup. He had been a senior structural engineer at Barrington Associates in Chicago for 6 years. He had worked on 2 hospitals, a mid-rise residential tower in the West Loop, a pedestrian bridge in Evanston that had won a regional design award he'd been sincerely proud of. He had been, by all assessments, including his own, very good at it. Sophie had died in February 4 years ago. Black ice on the Eisenhower Expressway, a chain reaction accident involving 4 vehicles. She had been on her way back from a weekend conference. She was 34. The grief had not been clean. It had not been the kind of grief that clarified things, that stripped away the unimportant and left the essential glowing. It had been gray and total for a long time. And what came out the other side of it, slowly, was not wisdom, but a very specific kind of clarity about one question. What does Lily need from me that no one else can give her? The answer was simple and demanding. Presence. Continuity. The knowledge that he would be there, not as an abstraction, not as a provider working long hours for a future she might appreciate later, but there, in the kitchen at 6:45 a.m., making pancakes. There, at 2:30 when the school doors opened. He had given notice at Barrington Associates on a Tuesday in June, 3 months after Sophie died. His colleagues had been kind and bewildered. His supervisor, a man named Paul Reichertz, who had mentored him since he was 26, had called him twice in the weeks that followed. Not to argue, but to say, simply, "The door is open." Daniel appreciated that. He had not gone back through the door. He had settled in Ravenwood, near Sophie's sister, near Autumn Lake, near the kind of unhurried pace that didn't ask anything of him he wasn't prepared to give. He had built Carter Repairs on his general contractor's license and his ability to see, very quickly, what was wrong with things. He was reliably the last person called, and the one who found what the others had missed. He did not charge for that. After school, he drove Lily home through the back roads that ran along the lake's south edge, and she sat in the passenger seat and told him what had happened during the day with the same completeness she brought to everything, not summarizing but narrating, as if the day were worth the full account. He listened and responded, and the drive home was never long enough for the story to end before they arrived, which he considered a feature rather than a problem. In the evenings, after dinner and the bath and the second chapter, he would sometimes sit on the back porch with a coffee and look at the lake, not thinking about much, not thinking about the work he'd left behind in Chicago, the Evanston Bridge or the hospital structures or the West Loop Tower, though he could see them clearly still, could walk through their specks in his mind, the way you can still walk a familiar room in the dark. He thought about them without grief. They existed. They were good. His name was not on them in any public way, and that was fine. They held. What he had come to understand, in the years since Sophie died, was that the question of a life's work was less about what you built and more about what you tended. Buildings, once built, required maintenance but not presence, not the specific, irreplaceable presence of the person who made the decision that determined whether the joint held or failed. A daughter was different. A daughter required the original engineer, continuously, in the small, unglamorous work of showing up. He did not sentimentalize this. He knew men had known men in Chicago who had made the same choice he had made and done it badly, had brought the same ambition and exactitude to fatherhood that they'd brought to their careers and produced children who felt inspected rather than loved. The point was not sacrifice. The point was attention. There was a difference, though it was the kind of difference that only revealed itself over years. He had not thought, when he drove to 14 Caldwell Avenue the previous night, that the house belonged to Clara Whitmore. He had not thought about Clara Whitmore at all. He had thought about the pipe. Clara Whitmore did not extend job offers lightly, and she had not extended one lightly to Daniel Carter. She had gone home from Linden Shore Road and sat at her desk for 2 hours, thinking about the note and what it represented, and about the project that was currently keeping her awake at night. Autumn Bridge was her largest residential development, a mixed-income community of 340 units on a former industrial site on the east side of Ravenwood, bordered on 2 sides by the river, requiring a new pedestrian bridge, extensive site remediation, and the construction of 4 building clusters over phased timelines. The project had broken ground 8 months ago. For the first 4 months, it had proceeded on schedule. Then, things had started going wrong. Not catastrophically. Not in ways that were easy to document or attribute. A concrete pour on Building C had failed its compressive strength test and required removal and repour attributed to a batch issue at the supplier. A steel shipment had arrived undersized, the wrong spec, per the supplier's records. though Whitmore's own purchase order clearly stated the correct dimensions. An inspection of the building. A foundation had flagged hairline cracking inconsistent with normal curing settlement. Clara had hired an independent structural review. The reviewer had found the cracking consistent with slightly insufficient rebar coverage within the tolerance of error, technically, but accumulating into a pattern that made her uneasy. Her site engineer, a careful woman named Bridget Holloway, had told her, "These things happen on complex projects. We're managing it." Bridget was competent and honest, and Clara trusted her. But something in the accumulation of small failures had begun to feel less like variance and more like direction. She had gone back to Daniel Carter, not because she was impulsive, but because the note he'd left behind had been the work of someone who read systems, who walked into a house in the middle of the night, in the rain, with a service ticket for a burst pipe, and came out the other side having assessed the structural integrity of the foundation wall. That was not a skill you learned from a contractor's license. She had looked him up. Once she had his name. She had found the Barrington Associates connection with 2 phone calls. She drove to Linden Shore Road on a Saturday, 12 days after their first meeting. She brought the project binders, the structural drawings, the site reports, the inspection records, all of it. She sat at Daniel's kitchen table. He had offered her coffee, and she had accepted while Lily was at a neighbor's birthday party, and she put the binders in front of him. "I'm not asking you to take a job," she said. "I'm asking you to look at these and tell me if I'm worried about the right things." Daniel looked at the binders. He looked at her. "How long have you been worried?" 3 months. "What does your site engineer say?" "She says it's manageable." "Do you believe her?" Clara was quiet for a moment. "I believe she believes it." Daniel opened the first binder. He didn't speak for a long time. He turned pages with the methodical attention she had seen him bring to the fence post, not rushing, not performing concentration, just reading. He had a pencil, and he made small notations in the margins, not asking permission, which she found she didn't mind. After 45 minutes, he closed the binder. "This wasn't a mistake," he said. Clara set her coffee cup down. "The rebar coverage issue in Building A. The steel undersizing. The failed pour." Daniel laid the 3 inspection reports side by side. "These failures have different causes on paper, but they all benefit the same outcome. Delay and cost overrun concentrated in buildings A and C, which are your load-bearing anchor structures. If those fall behind, the whole Phase 1 timeline collapses." Clara looked at the reports arranged in front of him, seeing what he was showing her, the pattern she'd felt but hadn't articulated. "You're saying someone designed the failure. I'm saying someone introduced it. Whether they designed it or took advantage of what was already there, I can't tell you from paper." He paused. "But I can tell you that a structural engineer who reviewed this would have the same question I do. And that question is, why is the concrete supplier's batch record for the failed pour dated 6 days before the pour date, when batches don't hold that long?" Clara looked at the batch record. She had looked at this document before. She had not noticed the date discrepancy. She had hired a structural engineer, a good one, Bridget's firm, to review the project. The engineer had flagged the cracking. The engineer had not flagged this. "You caught that in 45 minutes, Clara said. "It wasn't quite a question. It was the third thing I looked at," Daniel said. Marcus Hale was 63, chairman of Hale Properties Group, and had been the primary bidder on the Autumn Bridge site before Whitmore Development had outbid his group by 11% 2 years ago. He had taken the loss professionally, publicly, at least. He had sent Clara a brief note of congratulations. They sat on the same Chamber of Commerce subcommittee. They had spoken at industry events without incident. What Marcus Hale had done, beginning 8 months ago, was considerably less professional. Daniel found the thread by working backward from the batch record discrepancy. He was not, as he told Clara carefully, an investigator. He was reading structural and procurement documents and identifying where the data stopped making sense. Where it stopped making sense turned out to trace consistently toward a single subcontractor, a firm called Regional Supply Partners, which had handled the concrete and the steel delivery for Phase 1 and which had been introduced to the project by a recommendation letter on the letterhead of a commercial real estate advisory firm that turned out to share an address with a subsidiary of Hale Properties. Clara brought this to her attorney, a sharp litigator named Gordon Wells, who had handled Whitmore's contracts for 9 years. Gordon took one look at the documentation and told her to stop sharing it electronically and come into his office. What followed was 6 weeks of careful, disciplined work. Gordon building the legal case, Clara managing the projects day-to-day with Bridget, who, once shown the full picture, was furious and entirely cooperative. And Daniel, on the 3 evenings a week he could give her after 7:30 p.m., working through the structural implications. What could be remediated, what needed to be demolished and rebuilt, what the real timeline and cost looked like once you stripped away the manufactured delays. He was precise. He was honest about what he didn't know and explicit about what he did. He wrote everything in the same plain language style as the note he'd left at 14 Caldwell, and when Gordon needed to depose him about the batch record analysis, Daniel sat in Gordon's conference room and answered questions with the calm of a man who wasn't interested in drama and wasn't afraid of the truth. Marcus Hale's attorneys had initially argued that the subcontractor relationship was coincidental, and the failures were within normal project variance. Gordon had the batch record. He had the recommendation letter chain. He had Daniel's structural analysis showing that the failures were not random but directional. The case did not go to trial. Marcus Hale's group settled in a confidential agreement that included, among other provisions, financial contribution to the remediation costs and the quiet withdrawal of Marcus Hale from the chamber subcommittee he had shared with Clara. Clara stood in Gordon's lobby after the signing and felt not triumph, exactly. Something quieter. Relief, partly, and something harder to name. The particular satisfaction of having been right about what was wrong and having fixed it, which was not the same as winning. She called Daniel from the parking structure. "It's done," she said. A pause. "The settlement? Signed this morning. Good. The remediation plan you outlined, Bridget thinks 6 months if we start immediately. That's about right. Maybe 5 if the weather cooperates. I want to pay you for the work you've done on this." A longer pause. "You don't need to. I know I don't need to. I want to. Clara." He said her name with an evenness that wasn't dismissive. "I read some documents and answered some questions." Gordon did the work. Gordon didn't see the batch record date. Silence on the line. "Let me buy you and Lily dinner," she said. Somewhere she would like. Not a client dinner, just dinner. Another pause. "She likes the Italian place on Mill Street. They have a pasta with butter sauce she considers non-negotiable." "Mill Street it is," Clara said. "Saturday?" "Saturday works." 2 weeks before the Mill Street dinner, Clara and Daniel had stood together on the Autumn Bridge site on a gray Tuesday afternoon, the river visible from the east edge, willows dragging their yellow fingers in the current. The sky had the low, pressed-down quality of late October, and the air smelled of turned earth and river, and the particular metallic coldness that preceded the season's first hard frost. Bridget had walked them through the building. A remediation plan, systematic and thorough, the kind of plan Clara trusted because Bridget made no effort to make it sound easy. After Bridget moved on to a conversation with the crew lead, Clara and Daniel stood at the edge of the building footprint, looking at the exposed rebar and the marks where the compromised concrete had been removed. "Can I ask you something?" Clara said. "When you left Chicago, when you left the kind of work you were doing," she paused, constructing the question carefully. "Did it feel like giving something up? Or did it feel like choosing something?" Daniel was quiet for a moment. The wind moved across the site, lifting a sheet of plastic sheeting that someone had not weighted properly. "The first year, it felt like both," he said, "and I wasn't sure which feeling to trust. What changed?" He turned slightly, not toward her, but toward the river, which was visible between the framing of the future pedestrian bridge, the one they would build right, with the correct steel, with the proper inspections. "Lily was 5, he said. She'd been learning to read all year the way kids that age do. These big leaps and then plateaus. And one evening in November, she read me the entire first chapter of a book, by herself, without stopping. And she looked up at me when she finished and she said, "I did that, not to me, to herself." He paused. She didn't need me to have built anything that week. She needed me to be there when she said I did that. Clara did not answer immediately. The plastic sheeting snapped in the wind. "I think I've been very good at building things," she said finally. "I'm less certain about the other part." Daniel glanced at her. It was not pity, and it was not judgment. "You're here," he said. "That's not nothing." She looked out at the site, the interrupted structure, the careful markings of what would be fixed, what would be built again from the foundation. She thought about 14 Caldwell, and the note on the kitchen table, and the date on the batch record, and the way this man read systems, not just pipes and rebar, but the systems beneath those systems, the reasons things failed, and the paths back to sound. "You could do this work," she said. "Not an offer, an observation. I am doing this work for someone who charges nothing and leaves no name." He almost smiled. It was a contained expression, the corner of his mouth, a slight crease at his eye. "I charge for the pipe work," he said. "I just don't charge for the rest." Why not? He considered this for what felt like genuine time. Not the pause of someone deciding what to say, but someone actually working out what they thought. "Because the rest isn't a service," he said. "It's just seeing what's there. You can't really charge someone for looking." Clara thought about that for a long time. Even after they'd left the site, even in the car on the way back, even at her desk that evening. When the work of the day settled into the quiet of the house at 14 Caldwell, and she sat for a while, without opening her laptop. The Italian place on Mill Street was called Caruso's, and it had been there since 1978 and showed no signs of having changed its decor since then, which was entirely to its credit. Red and white checked tablecloths, candles in wine bottles, a chalkboard menu with 5 pastas, listed in handwriting that suggested whoever wrote it had been doing so for decades. Lily Carter arrived wearing a blue dress with small white flowers and carrying, under her arm, the book about the lighthouse keeper's daughter, which she had brought not because she intended to read it at dinner, but because she had not finished the chapter and was not prepared to leave it at home on a cliffhanger. She assessed Clara with a brief, serious look upon introduction, the way children do directly, without social buffer, and then she said, "Do you know about lighthouses?" "A little," Clara said. "Not as much as I'd like to." Lily considered this a satisfactory answer. She sat across from Clara with her book beside her plate and her hands in her lap and said, "The pasta here has butter sauce. I always get it." "Daniel mentioned," Clara said. Lily looked at her father with the particular expression of a child who has just learned she has been discussed in her absence. Not displeased. Pleased, in a contained way. The dinner was not what Clara had expected, which was that she wouldn't know what to do with a 7-year-old at the table. What she found instead was that Lily Carter conducted herself at dinner the way her father worked at a construction site, with attention, with opinions, without performance. She asked Clara what buildings she built, and when Clara described Autumn Bridge, the 4 clusters, the river, the pedestrian bridge, Lily said, "That sounds like it would be good for birds," which was not an observation Clara had considered, and which she found, unexpectedly, difficult to argue with. "What kind of birds?" Clara asked, genuinely curious now. Lily thought about this. "River birds," she said, "and the kind that like willows." "There are," Clara said. "We planted them as part of the bank stabilization." Lily nodded. "Willows are good for orioles," she said, with the authority of someone who had read this somewhere and taken it seriously. Clara looked at Daniel. He was eating his ossobuco and not helping, which she was beginning to understand was something he did when Lily was being exactly herself. Stepped back slightly, made room, let the thing be. "Then the orioles will appreciate the design choice," Clara said. Lily considered this response and approved of it. She picked up her fork. Daniel watched this exchange with the quietness he brought to most things not removed. Not proud in a performative way, just present. He ate his ossobuco and answered Lily's questions about the bridge's materials when she turned them toward him. And he refilled Clara's water glass when it was empty, and he ordered tiramisu without asking, because Lily had looked at it on the chalkboard menu for 20 seconds without speaking, which he apparently understood as consent. Clara watched him be this father, this presence, this steady warmth, and thought about what he had said on the construction site. You can't really charge someone for looking. After dinner, on the sidewalk outside Caruso's, Lily shook Clara's hand with a formality that suggested she had been instructed in the habit and had made it her own. "Thank you for dinner," she said. "Thank you for the information about lighthouses," Clara said. "You should read the book," Lily said, tucking it more firmly under her arm. "I think I'd need my own copy." Lily thought about this. "We could find you one," she said, and looked up at her father in the way of someone delegating logistics. "We could find her one," Daniel confirmed. Lily nodded, satisfied, and took her father's hand for the walk to the car. Clara stood on the Mill Street sidewalk in the October evening, the air cold and clean, the leaves of the ornamental trees along the block gone rust and bronze, and the particular dark gold of spent sunlight, and watched them go. It was 3 weeks after the dinner. The remediation at Autumn Bridge was underway, on schedule, the correct materials delivered and verified. Bridget Holloway running the site with the focused energy of someone who had been wronged and was correcting it. The legal matter was settled. The project was moving. Clara drove to Linden Shore Road on a Tuesday evening in late November. When the lake had gone, the color of pewter and the maple in Daniel's front yard had finally let go of its last leaves and stood clean and dark against the pale sky. She had not called ahead. She had, in the car on the way over, questioned whether this was appropriate and concluded that it was, and then questioned that conclusion, and then parked in front of number 22 and got out before she could continue the loop. Daniel answered the door in a flannel shirt and reading glasses pushed up on his head, which was a detail she hadn't expected. Behind him, the warm light of the front room, and Lily at the coffee table with a large sheet of paper and what appeared to be an entire collection of colored pencils spread around her in a pattern that was either organizational or chaotic, the distinction unclear. "Clara." He said it without surprise. He stepped back. She came in. Lily looked up from her drawing and said hi, with the easy familiarity of a child who has decided someone belongs in her world. "What are you drawing?" Clara asked. "The bridge," Lily said. "The one Dad's been helping with. He told me about the birds." Clara looked at the drawing, 4 rectangles arranged around a central path. The winding line of the river, a bridge with careful crosshatch detailing on the deck, and along the riverbanks, a row of small birds, each one slightly different, each one clearly attended to. "That's beautiful," Clara said. Lily looked at it critically. "The birds need more work," she said, and picked up a brown pencil. Clara turned to Daniel. He had taken her coat. He gestured toward the kitchen, the question universal. She nodded. They sat at the kitchen table with coffee. The sounds of Lily's work audible from the front room, the occasional scratch of pencil, the small sound she made when she was concentrating, something between a hum and a breath. Clara had come with a purpose. She had been carrying the question for weeks, not because she didn't know the answer, but because she wanted to hear him say it again, the way you return to a piece of music. Not because you don't know how it ends, but because the ending does something each time. "I came to ask you something," she said. He waited. "When I first came here the morning after Caldwell, I asked you why you left without your name." She paused. "You gave me an answer, but I don't think I understood it yet." Daniel held his coffee cup in both hands. He turned slightly toward the sounds from the front room, and his face did the thing it did, the slight softening. The quality of attention shifting like light through water. "She was just going to sleep when I left that night," he said. "Autumn, the first really cold night. She'd been sick the week before. Nothing serious, But she'd been home for 2 days, and I'd been there, and she'd gotten used to having me there more than usual. He paused. I thought about that while I was driving to Caldwell, about whether she'd wake up and find me gone. Clara was quiet. I've spent a lot of years building things, Daniel said. You spend that time, you learn something about what lasts. A building a good one built right, it holds. It remembers your work in the stone and the steel and the joints. It carries the decisions you made. That's a real thing. He looked toward the front room again. But a child doesn't remember your work the way stone does, he said. They remember whether you were there, whether you came home, whether you knew what book they were reading. He was quiet for a moment. When you spend your life building things, you eventually have to answer a question. What are you actually trying to build? What's the thing that holds? Clara felt something in her chest, not a dramatic thing, not a revelation with weather in it. Something quieter, the particular sensation of understanding, something you'd known was true but hadn't yet found the words for. And you stopped chasing your name, she said softly. The name follows the work. But the work, the real work, doesn't always have your name on it. Outside the window of the kitchen, Autumn Lake was invisible in the dark. But you could feel it there, the cold weight of it, the depth, the patience of old water. From the front room, Lily made a small sound of satisfaction, the sound of a detail getting right, of a bird becoming finally what she had intended it to be. Clara sat with that sound. She thought about the $3-4-0 million portfolio. She thought about the Philadelphia meetings and the Meridian Capital Financing Group and the mornings she had woken at 5 a.m. In hotel rooms in cities she couldn't always immediately name and checked her email before she checked the window. She thought about what she was building and whether the name on the building was the thing she was protecting or only the thing she'd been told to protect. She did not say any of this. This was not that kind of conversation. But she held it the way you hold something you've just found and are not yet sure where to put. She's almost done, Daniel said. He nodded toward the front room. Can I see it when she's finished? She'll want to show you. And she did. 5 minutes later, Lily appeared in the kitchen doorway, holding the drawing with 2 careful hands. The bridge, the river, the 4 building clusters, the improbable and specific birds along both banks, each one attended to, each one different, each one exactly where it had decided to be. That's Autumn Bridge, Lily said. Clara looked at it for a long time. It is, she said. Outside, the first snow of the season was beginning, not a storm, just the leading edge of winter arriving with its customary lack of announcement, snow falling in slow diagonals through the lamplight on Linden Shore Road, settling on the bare branches of the maple, on the painted railing of the porch, on the dark surface of Autumn Lake. Inside the small Cape Cod on Linden Shore Road, a drawing of a bridge sat on the kitchen table. The birds on it still wet with color, the light warm, and the snow coming down outside the way it always did, quietly, without asking permission, covering everything equally. Daniel Carter poured more coffee without asking. Clara Whitmore, for the first time in a very long time, did not check her phone.